Welcome to the May Oklahoma Business Ethics Consortium's presentation. I'm Bailey Gordon, the Interim Executive Director for the organization. I know I can speak on behalf of our board when I say that we're glad you've joined us on Zoom today to learn our 7 survival skills from our speaker, Jim Priest. So just for a few housekeeping items before we get started, we will issue CPE certificates for today for those of you who request them. So in order to request them, go ahead and go into the chat and type your name and CPE, and we will download that at the end of the program and make sure that you are all emailed that your certificate. So those will go out by next week, and I can already see all of those coming in. So thank you for requesting. All right, we are also going to be screenshotting our list, making sure that everyone's staying within the room. So you do need to be here for the duration of the program to receive your CPE credit. We also, our speakers planned a really great interactive program for today. So we also have a few polls that we'll be doing. He's going to be asking the audience a few questions. So whenever he does that, feel free to raise your hand. We can turn on your microphone or use the chat feature. So probably the chat will be the absolute easiest with the number of participants that we have on the call today. But if you are not seeking CPE credit, I still encourage you to participate in those so that it makes it a more engaging and interactive program. So like I said, for those of you who may be new logging in, if you are interested in receiving your CPE certificate for today, please put your name and CPE in the chat. I'll do a reminder in the chat periodically throughout the program. All right, we also know we've gotten lots of questions on our past webinars as well. So we are recording today's session, and that will be available on the OK Ethics website, along with the deck of slides from today. So if you enjoy the program, we are going to email that link out to everyone following, probably next week as well, once we get the video edited and put onto the website. Okay, I think that is all of the housekeeping items for today. Thank you again for joining us, and we'll begin today's program with our guiding principle, which is going to be presented by Myrna Latham. So Myrna Latham is a shareholder in the McAfee and Taft law firm, where she's practiced for the past 35 years. Her primary practice area is commercial real estate transactions. She also represents a number of nonprofit organizations. Myrna received her undergraduate degree from Southern Nazarene University and her law degree from the University of Oklahoma College of Law. Myrna has always had a strong interest in business ethics and the values and principles that govern actions and decisions in the business world. Myrna has served on the board of directors for Oklahoma Ethics for more than 15 years, ever since the organization was formed. So we appreciate your service, Myrna. In addition, Myrna is the chair of her law firm's Legal Ethics Committee, and she previously served on the Oklahoma Bar Association's Legal Ethics Committee. So thank you, Myrna, for sharing with us today, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thanks very much, Bailey. And I want to give a quick shout out to Bailey. She was recognized by OKC Friday newspaper as one of Oklahoma City's 50 most powerful young professionals. So please join me in giving Bailey a virtual round of applause.
Thank you, Myrna. That's very kind.
And I apologize, I look like I'm sitting by a campfire, so forgive the technical difficulties, but I kind of like the mood lighting. Anyway, to move on to our guiding principle, when I was looking through our guiding principles, it struck me that one of the cornerstones of our guiding principles is responsibility to self and others. And if you look at the list of our guiding principles, you see that that includes several different concepts. It includes collaboration, respect, service. Service includes responsibility and accountability for fulfilling the mission of OK Ethics, encouraging the promotion of ethical behavior through personal actions. And so all of those concepts have been front and center, it seems like, during the last 2 months. Our lives have changed so much since that fateful night on March 11th, when the game between the Thunder and the Utah Jazz was stopped right before tip-off. because a Utah player had tested positive for COVID-19. And I think all of us who have an interest in ethical issues have been amazed at the myriad of ethical issues that have arisen as the coronavirus pandemic has unfolded. Everything from medical ethics, questions about which patients get respirators or which get drugs, if there's a shortage of respirators or drugs, and of course, business ethics issues, things like price setting and even price gouging for drugs and respirators, PPE, things that are in short supply. And then just the sort of issues that we're all facing right now, those difficult decisions about whether putting our workforce at increased personal risk outweighs the economic loss of keeping businesses shut down. So some of us are part of essential businesses that have served on the front lines and continue to provide vital services throughout this pandemic. Others of us are in the process of getting ready to reopen our businesses. We're developing things like return to work plans and trying to figure out what all that looks like. And additional ethical dilemmas related to responsibility to self and others are just going to continue to arise as states and our cities start easing all of these virus-related restrictions that we've been dealing with, and everyone starts returning to work. For example, if my company's return to work policy discourages and requires reporting of any out-of-state travel, and I want to make a quick drive down to Dallas for Memorial Day weekend to visit a family member, do I really need to report that to HR? I mean, Dallas is so close. That's not going to matter, right? Or what do I do when I encounter people who I think are ignoring social distancing rules? Is it my responsibility to police them? A growing number of Americans are calling the authorities on people that they think are flouting those social distancing requirements. So I want to spend a few minutes just talking about responsibility to self and others and how we can encourage the promotion of ethical behavior during the coronavirus pandemic through our own personal actions. Lately, I've been reading a lot about what they call caution fatigue or quarantine fatigue. You've probably seen some of these articles too. In fact, there was an article in yesterday's Oklahoman that had the headline, "Desensitized to Warnings, How Caution Fatigue May Slow Social Distancing Efforts." And according to the article, psychologists are warning that caution fatigue may start to affect people's choice to make safe decisions, not only for themselves, but for their communities. People become desensitized to warnings because their brain is adjusting to all the alarms that it's been receiving. As one psychologist explained, when a person is exposed to a warning repeatedly, they start to pay less attention to it. And that can lead to either ignoring the alarms or not responding as quickly to them. And so there have always been those who thought that COVID-19 is really nothing more than a bad version of the flu. But as the coronavirus spreads and continues on and on and on, more people, even those who take the pandemic seriously and understand and believe the science about how it's transmitted, well, we're growing weary of those social distancing guidelines. For some of us, the restrictions of staying at home have been stressful or boring, or for many, financially devastating. And even those of us who are working from home are starting to long for the outlet that our office provides, strangely enough. And the data shows that quarantine fatigue is real. Researchers at the University of Maryland studied cell phone location data and found that starting Friday, April 17th, people across the country began going out more frequently, traveling longer distances at home. Public spaces like parks and beaches are seeing increased foot traffic. But even as states and cities begin to lift their stay at home or safer at home orders, public health experts are continuing to warn us that the coming weeks are a critical time. So this means we need to resist the urge to return to socializing and life as we knew it pre-pandemic. And what can we do to fight that caution fatigue and quarantine fatigue? Well, another interesting article that I saw yesterday was in the New York Times. It was titled, "You're Stronger Than Your Quarantine Fatigue." And in the article, a behavioral economist talked about how to keep going in what has turned into a marathon. First, remind yourself that while fatigue may be setting in, this hasn't gone away. We can't just ignore it and pretend it's not there. So when you go out in public, and it is becoming harder, I think, to maintain true social distancing, do show social responsibility and even solidarity by wearing a mask, even if you feel silly doing it. If you're out walking, make it easier for people to keep their distance from you when they're crossing the street, cross to the other side if need be. Continue to focus on our responsibility to yourself and also to others. Even if we're getting tired of hearing about it, we really are all in this together. And just remember, you're stronger than your quarantine fatigue. So keep that in mind. And I think that Jim is going to be telling us a lot about those continuing challenges that we're all facing. It's really a privilege for me to introduce Jim. He's truly one of my favorite speakers and one of my favorite people. Jim's wife, Diane, was one of my college classmates, so I feel like I've known Jim for a long, long time. He's a husband, a dad, an ordained minister, and I'll add to that list, a recovering lawyer. He recently, very recently, became the president and CEO of Goodwill Industries of Central Oklahoma. Jim has regularly appeared on television before groups speaking, writing about employment law, workplace issues, ethics, marriage, family issues. He writes a weekly column for the Oklahoman. He's been doing that for over 20 years, called Family Talk, that addresses issues related to marriage, parenting, and families. He's also served as a columnist for the Journal Record newspaper, writing columns on business ethics. Jim and his wife, Diane, have 2 children, Amanda and Spencer, a dog named Jeter. Oh, did I mention Jim is a huge baseball fan? And Jim is also what he describes as an elite level grandfather of a namesake grandson, James. So we're so fortunate, Jim, to have you as our speaker today. Please join me in giving Jim a virtual welcome.
Well, thank you. The thunderous applause is overwhelming. I'm going to be sharing some thoughts with you on the topic of survival skills. And Lynn Flynn kind of texted us in the chat room. I should have worn my safari hat, which I used for, I think, the 10th anniversary of OK Ethics. I'm want to dress up from time to time. I did bring a mask. They didn't have my Yankees mask yet, so I got my OU Sooners mask, but I won't wear that during the presentation since we're appropriately socially distanced. We're going to talk about social or survival skills in a crisis, in particular from an ethical standpoint. And I want to share a PowerPoint with you, and we're going to do some Q&A back and forth. Typically, those of you that have been involved with seminars I've done in the past know that I throw candy to the audience. So unfortunately, we can't do that today. So you all get a credit. You get 2 candy bars next time you come to one of my seminars. So let's see if we can't queue up the PowerPoint. We'll do a share. Share screen. Here we go. And forgive my lack of technical prowess. You're still getting it queued up. Bailey, can we see that? Can everybody see that?
We can see that. So I think you're ready to
roll? Okay.
Yes.
I was hoping to make this a little bit bigger so I can see it. Oh, here we go. There we are. All right, forgive me. All right, so we're here at Goodwill headquarters, and as Myrna suggested, I just started just a few weeks ago and have been swimming in the deep end of the pool. So we want to think about survival skills because we're in a survival situation, so to speak. So when you hear the term survival skills, what do you think of? Maybe you think of a survivalist, right? There's TV shows about this. We've seen news reports about people that live in the woods and have ammunition and are ready for the Armageddon. Or maybe you think of something you've got in your own home, a survival kit. My daughter used to work for the American Red Cross, and she was always telling me, Daddy, you got to have your survival kit. And so it's good to have something like that in the event of an emergency. Or maybe you're a follower of the zombie apocalypse and you think, well, I'm ready for that. I've watched all the zombie related shows and I know what to do if there's a zombie apocalypse. The word survive, I thought it was kind of an interesting word. I'm a big fan of word derivations, and survive kind of has this slightly depressing aspect to it. It says to continue to live or exist, especially in spite of danger or hardship, to manage to keep going in difficult circumstances. I kind of like to up the game a little bit. I'd like to have something not just barely hanging on by our fingernails, but to continue to thrive, especially in spite of danger and hardship. But when we think of survival, we typically think of, we're just going to try to do what we can to get by in light of the hardship. And then crisis, we know from experience what that is, don't we? We're living through it. It's a word that arose out of the early 15th century. And interestingly, it meant the decisive point in the progress of a disease. So basically, it was like the turning point. You're either going to get better or you're going to die. And that was what crisis first meant. Now we've kind of broadened that definition. But it's the point at which change must come, for better or worse. Many of you are probably familiar with the Chinese word for crisis is actually two Chinese characters put together. Interesting combination, danger and opportunity. So in a crisis, it's like that 15th century derivation. It's going to get better, it's going to get worse. We're going to die or we're going to get better. And I think the current crisis shows that sometimes, as Myrna was suggesting, we're feeling such a high degree of fatigue, maybe caution fatigue, but maybe physically and mentally as well, that it's hard to see that the good is going to come. I thought of a quote when Myrna was sharing the guiding principle, fatigue makes cowards of us all. And so we have to make sure that we're doing the kinds of things that enhance our opportunity for self-preservation, like making sure that we take mental health breaks and get some physical exercise, take good care of ourselves. When I was working for Sunbeam Family Services, one of the most interesting facts I learned from our senior program, where we took care of senior adults and caregivers, was that most caregivers die before the people that they're caring for. I was stunned by that. But the reason, when you think of it, makes sense. They are giving out so much of themselves that they're not taking care of themselves. So we need to do what the airline people tell us to do back in those days. Remember when we used to get on airplanes? They'd say, when the air mask drops down, put yours on first so that you can take care of other people like your kids or your grandmother. But if you don't get your face mask on first, you're not going to be conscious to take care of other folks. So that's the crisis. And we find ourselves really in a confluence of crisis. You know, in the physical world, a confluence is where many rivers come together. And that's what I think we're seeing in this crisis that mainly suggests that it's a healthcare crisis, but it's really much broader, deeper, and wider than that. We've got the physical health aspects, but we've also got the mental health aspects both on a micro scale and a macro scale. The economic health, both of our individual lives and our nation as a whole, are imperiled. We've got relationship health. I saw several postings about people saying, well, I really love my husband and wife, but I'm not ready for them to get out of the house and for me to have some relationships with other people besides this person I've been quarantined with. But on a big scale, we've got real questions about societal health. You probably saw the news story in the last couple of days. A security guard at I think it was a Dollar Tree or Family Dollar store in Michigan was shot because he tried to tell someone they were required to have a face mask before they came in the store. So what kind of dysfunction creates an environment where somebody would be so exercised that they'd want to shoot somebody over being instructed to wear a face mask? You've seen scenes like this, the nurse who was just kind of silently protesting the people that were coming to the Capitol to complain about the shelter in place or the safer at home regulations that many states were imposing. So there's I use the word confluence, it's almost a cacophony, a symphony, a cacophony of noise and crises that are coming to bear. And it behooves us, particularly as leaders, to make sure that we got the skill set that's required to deal with this. So when you think about skills, you typically think about, well, a carpenter has certain skills. He's learned it, she's been apprenticed, they've practiced, and it's a skill set that they've acquired over time, as opposed to a trait, which is more of maybe a character quality or personality trait. And a distinction is often made that, well, there are skills and then there are traits. And if you got a trait, you got it. But if you got a skill, you got it through acquisition. You learned it, you were apprenticed. I saw an article in BizFluent by a lady named Claire Jackson who said, you learn skills through experience. You know, think about the carpenter. Whereas traits, and she's making a distinction here, whereas traits are integral to who you are, either through genetics, that's just the way I am, or through experiences. And her quote kind of left me scratching my head, and the conclusion I came to is, well, it sounds like experiences can teach us character traits. And I think that's absolutely true. We know that intuitively and anecdotally from our own lives, that we've been through some crisis, and not only did we maybe learn a skill, but we also acquired a trait. So that's kind of where we're headed today. We're going to be talking about, we're calling them skills, but they really kind of mesh into the trait category, and sometimes it's hard to tell the real difference between a skill and a trait. So here's your first opportunity to weigh in. I want to find out, what have you done to survive during this? Some of you have been quarantined, some of you were involved in essential businesses. So we have Bailey queue up some multiple choice questions here, and you get to vote. And I'd be throwing a candy bar to you if you participated. You get to vote in Bailey's poll. So Bailey, can we put that on the screen?
Yes, I will. And Jim, your slides, I believe you need to push the little button at the top to play. We haven't seen the slides scroll through yet. We're still on the title page.
Oh my goodness. I'm so
So
sorry.
I will get the poll rolling while we do this.
All right, it's advancing on mine.
Okay.
All right, so this is an opportunity for you to weigh in. I don't know. They're telling me my slides are not.
Yeah, they're not scrolling through. Can you exit out of this?
It's is anybody voting, Bailey?
Yes, we've got lots of votes. So far, it looks like a majority of people have been walking, running, and biking, so getting their exercise. We're at 51% are exercising, 18% are meditating and praying. We've got 7% reading, 11% helping others, and 13% are like me who like to eat.
Yeah, I wondered what the collective weight gain of America was going to be after the quarantine.
You know, I feel like it's a toss-up because I've also seen so many people being so much more active, being outside and taking walks in the neighborhood. So we'll have to see. But yes, it looks like our results are in, and walking, running, and biking is the winner at 50%.
All right. So can you see my slide that says, what have you done to survive?
So we are still at slide 1, and it says upload failed. I'm not sure what that means. There we go. Now we're at what have you done to survive? Perfect.
Okay.
I see your laser pointer.
Very good. I'm getting texts from people.
Here we are. Thank you everyone for the messages, and thanks for participating in the poll.
All right. So what was our highest percentage, Bailey?
Our highest percentage was 50% are walking, running, and biking. So they're getting their exercise.
All right. Well, that's part of that. I think it serves both mental and physical health for us to do that, and it also offsets all those donuts you've been eating as well. Some of us are kind of analytical in our approach, and we're trying to figure out what, maybe mathematically or organizationally or logistically, what can I do to survive? And you've done a lot of that already through the things that Bailey's revealed in the poll. All right. So you're going to get this several times, so don't feel like you need to compulsively write these things down. But here's the 7 survival skills that we're going to be talking about: grace, optimistic, wholehearted, other-oriented, decisive, integrity, and laughter. And one of the things you'll notice about this list, it doesn't include things like really whip smart or insightful financial acuity. Those are great things to have, and they're needed, certainly. But those of you that have read the book, Emotional Intelligence 2.0, know that what is a greater marker of your success in life and in the workplace are not those what we traditionally call hard side skills, but it's what has been misnomered soft side skills. But it's people skills, and that's kind of what all of these have as a root commonality, is that they're really interpersonal interaction skills. So just quickly, a little history. March 9th, I came on board at Goodwill, and that's my Yankee apron. I was cooking breakfast for our employees here at the main campus. And off to a great start, right? I had an agenda. I'm going to accomplish all these things. I was going to visit all the stores. We have 25 stores and 20 donation centers. And in the first 60 days, I was going to visit all of those, make sure I connected with employees. And then just 2 weeks later, we got the order from Governor Stitt and Mayor Holt and all the other mayors, shut down Goodwill, Mr. Priest. No longer was it welcome, Mr. Priest. It was we got shut down. We've got to be safer at home and shelter in place. And you are not an essential business. So we shut down. We laid off, furloughed 650 plus people, resulted in about a $3 million loss in revenue. And if you don't know this about Goodwill, one of the things we're going to try to do in the coming days is tell the story better. But it's not just retail stores or thrift stores. That's a big part of what we do, but the revenue from those stores fuels our mission. So not only are we $3 million in the hole, it's not just a business loss, it's a mission loss as well. And so we're really scratching our heads thinking, okay, well, what's the path forward? Fortunately, we had some options. And then we got the word, okay, time to open up. And so on May 4th, just Monday of this week, we reopened our stores and donation centers got back to work at our warehouse. We're trying to do it with enhanced precautions and safety. Our employees are masked and gloved. We're doing lots of different things to enhance the safety, both for employees and for our customers. But when I think of survival, which is kind of the mode we've been in, I think of this guy. And I don't know how many of you know this fellow, Sir Ernest Shackleton, but Shackleton came to my attention probably maybe 15 years ago or so. I was reading a book, and I was a history major in college, and I thought I had a good education. But it was referencing Shackleton in this book that was not about him. And it's probably one of the preeminent leaders of expeditions in our time. And I thought to myself, how did I not learn about this guy? I had a good education. I've never heard of this guy. Who is he? So I began to do some research, and he's really a remarkable character. We're going to talk about him and then kind of go back and forth between the application of how he survived his ordeal. But this is what Sir Raymond Priestley, who himself was an Antarctic explorer, said. For scientific leadership, give me Robert Scott. Robert Scott was an Antarctic explorer for years, very well known. For swift and efficient travel, give me Raoul Amundsen. Amundsen was the first person to make it to the South Pole. But when disaster strikes, and when you're in a hopeless situation, when there seems no way out, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. Man, I'd love for somebody to say something like that about me. You know, hey, we're in a hopeless situation. We should get down on our knees and pray the priest shows up. But this is the legacy of Ernest Shackleton. We're going to find out why. He had a ship called the Endurance, and it set sails, we'll see in just a few minutes, in 1914. It's one of the greatest survival adventures of all time. So as my personalities want to do, when I find out something like this, I go out and buy every book I can find on Ernest Shackleton. I now have 15 books on Ernest Shackleton. I have the DVD set about his life, and I just dove in head first to find out about this guy. In fact, I have two huge posters that are framed at my home, one of his ship and one of him, just as a reminder to me, this is a guy who had character traits and survival skills that I want to emulate. So what did he do? Well, he was one of the principal figures in what's called the heroic age of exploration. The late 1800s, 1900s, the world was not fully explored yet. People were going to Africa, and people were, believe it or not, they were going to Antarctica. Now it's kind of a cool thing to do. You go on a National Geographic boat and somewhat comfortable, but back then it was not very comfortable. He ventured to Antarctica several times. He was with Robert Scott on the unsuccessful attempt to get to the South Pole before Raoul Amundsen did. And he decided, okay, well, that goal is gone. I can't be the first one to get to the South Pole, but I could be the first one to cross the South Pole like dog sled. Would that look good on your resume? And so he said, that's going to be my goal. I'm going to recruit men. I'm going to get a ship. The bottom line is he never made it. And yet, he is revered as a tremendous example of leadership and survival skills. It'd be like somebody saying, well, I went to major leagues to play baseball and I struck out every time, but I'm in the Baseball Hall of Fame. They seem somewhat incompatible, but you'll see why. Here's how he approached recruiting. He put an ad in the paper, and this is what it said: men wanted for a hazardous journey. Small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful, honor and recognition in case of success. Come see me at 4 Burlington Street. Well, if you saw that ad in the paper, or if you were recruiting for your organization, is that the ad you'd put in? Hey, come work for us. Not very good. We don't really have comfortable furniture, and we don't have any kind of good pay. No retirement benefits, but you know, there might be something in it for you. he was deluged with people from all over the world who wanted to go with him because he had this reputation, the reputation of being someone who put his men first, who was goal-oriented, who was adventurous, who was a risk taker, but for good reason. So I love that. And in fact, I got a coffee mug with that ad on it. We've not used it as a recruiting tool at Goodwill yet, but maybe. So he recruited 27 men. He had a number of women as well that applied, some from as far away as America, but he picked these 27 people to go with him on what he called the Transantarctic, the Royal Transantarctic Expedition. And their goal was to cross this frozen wasteland of Antarctica on dog sleds. And the reward would be, hey, they'd come back and talk about it. Maybe people would pay to give speeches, and he would go down in the history books as the first person to have done that. So he leaves in August 1914, just as World War I breaks out. In fact, there was a moment when he volunteered himself, his ship, and his crew to Great Britain for the war effort. But the British government said, no, you set your sails for Antarctica, go ahead, and so they released him to go. And we'll see in just a minute the path he took. But before they even reached landfall into Antarctica, his ship got stuck in the ice. Now, that was not completely unknown for ships that traveled down there. And so he had purchased a ship that was extra strong in the hull to resist the vicissitudes of Antarctic ice. But ultimately, this ship was so stuck and the ice was so strong, it crushed it. So he was shipwrecked in Antarctica and lived on the ice with his men for 19 months. 19 months. You think about, we've been in this COVID crisis for what, 6-7 weeks? 19 months he's on the ice, but not one man perished. And I think that's the remarkable achievement for which he's most well known. He kept all his men safe. So here's, they had a photographer. Again, Shackleton is thinking ahead. He's thinking, well, we sell these photographs. In fact, he sold the rights to the photographs in advance in order to finance the trip. So they had a photographer who took great pictures. If you get on the internet, you can find lots of different photos of the expedition. And you can see as time went on, the ship began to list and list more. And then eventually that's all was left of it. So the men had to get off the ship. They set up camp on the ice. They salvaged what they could from the shipwreck, and they had to move forward. So they set up a camp that they called Patience Camp. They had tents. They had some equipment to cook meals and that sort of thing. They had good provisions because they were going to be traveling across the Antarctic continent. And they lived on that ice, and the ice moved constantly, and sometimes it would separate. There was a story about one night Shackleton could hear a noise, and he realized the ice was cracking beneath them, and so he got out of his tent just in time to see a crack open and one of his men drop in. And sometimes what would happen is then the ice would close back up and the man would be forever lost. Before the ice could close back, Shackleton reached down there. He just happened to be out of his tent in the middle of the night, pulled the man to safety, and he was saved. But constant danger, animals, walruses attacking them. So this gives you a little bit of an idea. This is the path. They started, this is South America over here. And they started at an island called South George Island, where they were provisioned again, and then they sailed toward Antarctica. This is the landmass of Antarctica here, and this is all ice flow and ocean, the Belt Sea. And right here, on January of, I think it's 18th of 1915, their ship is beset in the ice, so it's frozen. They can't move forward or backward, and the ice then shoves them northward away from their goal, eventually crushes the ship here in October of that year. They have to abandon the ship. Then the Endurance sinks completely. And so they're living basically on the ice and always ready to jump in the lifeboats if need be. They finally launch lifeboats that they have, and they make their way in uncharted territory to a completely abandoned spit of land called Elephant Island. There were no elephants on the island. I don't know how it got that name, but they lived there for a while, and then they realized nobody's coming for us. We got to save ourselves. So they retrofitted one of the lifeboats, built a top over it, made it a sailboat, and about 5 or 6 of the men then started a most perilous journey across a very dangerous stretch of the South Atlantic to get back to South Georgia Island, where they landed on the wrong side of the island. There were provisions and a camp on the far side, but their ship only lasted till they could get to the wrong side of the island, and they had to climb a glacier and go down the other side of the glacier to get to the camp so that they could get a rescue ship and go back and get the men on Elephant Island, which they ultimately did. So what a terrific story. They made this desperate lifeboat trip, then the treacherous crossing of the South Atlantic to South Georgia, climb the glaciers, and ultimately everybody is saved. So you may borrow one of my 15 books if you want to read more about this. So you heard this story now. What do you think of the Shackleton story? Bailey's going to put up some multiple guess question or multiple guess answers. Maybe you might say, I've never heard that story before. Or maybe your reaction is, well, it's interesting, but it's an old story. It really doesn't relevant today. Or maybe you might think, yeah, I think there might be something to learn from that guy.
Well, the results are coming through and they're changing. We've got lots of people voting, but we're pretty split down the middle that there's something to be learned from him, and I've never heard it before. So we've got about 55% say there's something to be learned, and 45 say they've never heard it before.
Yeah.
I don't know that I've never really heard this story either.
And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You might never have heard of it, but you might think, well, maybe there is something to be learned. That's kind of the way I felt when I first heard of this guy. I thought, I've never heard of it before. How did I miss this? And then when you start digging and you find out, I don't know how many books, there's probably 50 books written on him. You think, man, I must have been sleeping during that history class when they covered him.
Yeah. It looks like 76% of people voted, and 54% say there's something to be learned, and 45 say they've never heard the story before.
All right. Well, now you've got a little bit of insight about Shackleton and about his men. So let's see. Is there anything to be learned from this? Yeah, there's our poll results. More candy bars owed to the audience. Collectible at the next live. Okay, ethics. All right. So in the 20th century, I think Shackleton was a little bit forgotten. And in the 20th century, he was kind of rediscovered, as is often the case when there's an anniversary that comes up. Some enterprising author thinks, oh, I could make some money off this guy. So Carolyn Alexander wrote probably the definitive book that kind of launched the rediscovery of Shackleton. But he rapidly became a role model for leadership as one who in extreme circumstances kept his crew together. Just an incredible story. And I want to add here, Shackleton's home life was not that great. He had personal problems, he had family problems, and you can imagine being gone for years on these expeditions could cause those sorts of things. It's hard to be a successfully balanced person. And I'm a big believer in making sure that our priority is placed on our family. Years ago, I kind of made myself motto, if I am a success in the world but a failure at home, I will have been a failure. but if I'm a success at home, even if I'm a failure in the world, I will have been a success. So as we're talking about these business principles, remember they have application, maybe equal application to our family life and our home life as well. So what was Shackleton's secret? What can we learn from it? From my 15-book survey, I've kind of drawn some principles that we will scroll through. Let me consult my time. Okay, we're good. We've got, looks like 3 hours left. So we'll continue. Just kidding. Just don't abandon me. All right, so just a refresher, here's those 7 character qualities that we talked about. They're traits, but they're also skills, I think, that can be learned. So grace, I think, is the first one. I don't know that Shackleton ever used that word, but he was certainly someone who practiced it, and I define it as the ability to forgive in advance. His captain was a guy named Frank Worsley. And Worsley was one of the men who traveled with him from Elephant Island to South Georgia Island and climbed that great glacier, and a very harrowing journey in itself. And this is what Worsley said about this. On this march across the glaciers of South Georgia, we treated each other with a good deal more consideration than we should have done in normal circumstances. Never is etiquette and good form observed more carefully than by experienced travelers when they find themselves in a tight place. I always think of that movie, Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Because George Clooney was always saying, man, we're in a tight spot. And that's kind of where we are right now. But think about this, when you see people in a tight spot, think about the last time you did airline travel, and maybe the flight is running late and kids are crying. Is this what you see amongst the passengers? Etiquette and good form, and treating each other with more consideration rather than less. You know, I'm trying to be an optimistic person and see the best in others, but that's not typically what I see when people are in a tight spot. Usually they abandon the normal consideration that they might give others, and they think, well, you know, I've got to survive. I'm in a crisis. And so having the ability to give grace, to forgive in advance is important. We talked about the deal here at Goodwill when we started into this crisis. And the deal is something that my wife came up with when we were facing a family crisis years ago. We both needed to deal with the situation. We knew it was going to last a while. We didn't know exactly what the path ahead was going to be. And so we were kind of thinking through the logistics and how we wanted to handle it. And Diane said to me, let's make a deal. We both are well-intentioned. We know we want the best outcome involved in this, but we're going to make mistakes. And so one of us will make a decision before the other one finds out about it. And there's going to be a tendency to second guess. Let's not do that. Let's decide in advance. We're going to give each other lots of grace, lots of advanced forgiveness, and we're not going to second guess each other. And I thought, that sounds reasonable. That sounds like a good plan. Till she made a decision that I didn't agree with. And then I was like, wow, why did you do that? And Diane kind of held up one finger and she said, remember the deal? Oh yeah, okay. And I had to do that a couple times to her. But it was a good default for us to know, hey, we've agreed in advance. We're going to give each other a lot of grace. We don't know how this COVID crisis is going to evolve. It might change. We might have a surge in the fall. We're trying to make things up as we go along. We're making our best guesses about what's the right way to protect our employees. And so we decided here at Goodwill, we're going to do the deal. We're not going to second guess each other. We're not going to come in afterwards and say, oh, you should have done this, you should have done that. We're going to give each other a lot of advanced forgiveness. And that's been a very helpful thing for me personally, and I think for our entire team. Now, let me take a scenic turn out here for just a minute and remind you that just because I'm talking about these things doesn't mean I do them perfectly. And I need a lot of this grace from my team and from members in the community. We're doing the best we can, but just because I'm talking about it doesn't mean I've got the corner on the market of truth here. All right, the second principle is to be other oriented, to put other people before yourself, which sounds very magnanimous and such a good thing, but hard to do in the heat of a crisis. So for this example, we look at a guy named Frank Wild. Frank had traveled with Shackleton on other expeditions. He was the number 2 guy behind Worsley in the chain of command. And Frank Wild said this about Shackleton giving Wild his last biscuit as they were trying to get back to the ship on one of the other expeditions to the South Pole that was unsuccessful. Wild said, "I do not suppose anyone in the world can realize how much generosity and sympathy was shown by giving me a biscuit. But I do, by God, and I shall never forget it." And Wild was one of those people that was so loyal to Shackleton. If Shackleton had said, you need to strip off all your clothes and jump in that icy water, Wild would have done it without a moment's hesitation. And part of this is reflective of what became a hallmark for Shackleton. Early in his career, Shackleton became known as a leader who put his men first. He was other-oriented. And I think that's something we need to do in our personal lives. We need to do in our organizational lives. We are attempting here every day to create an employee-first culture where we let decisions be filtered through the template of what's in the best interests of our employees. Are we taking really good care of our employees? And this is not a new concept from me or at Goodwill. Where I learned it is from Southwest Airlines. They treat their employees great so that the employees will treat the customers great, and the customers will keep coming back, and the stockholders will be happy. And what a recipe for success it's been for Southwest Airlines, to be an employee-first, other-oriented. So when I fly Southwest, which is not so much the past few weeks, but frequently otherwise, I always try to get a Southwest employee aside and have a private conversation with them. And I ask them, hey, I've heard this stuff about, really great employee culture, but I want to know the truth, and I won't share it with anybody. Is it really true? And without exception, they've all said, absolutely. They treat their employees great. And so I think that's a call to us. It's a skill, but it's also a trait. And we have to decide up front, this is going to be the template through which we make decisions. It really helps to have your compass bearing before you get lost in the woods. It really helps before you get in a crisis mode to know when we make decisions in crisis, we're going to make it through the template or with the compass bearing of an employee-first culture. Optimism. We think of optimism often as, well, that's just kind of the way you were born. You're just optimistic, and this person over here, they're just pessimistic, or maybe they think they're realistic. They tend to see the half glass that's not full, and the other person sees a half glass full. But optimism is envisioning a better future when the present vision is kind of grim. So it's seeing things that are not yet evident, but can be, the potential there. And this was probably the quintessential element and character of Shackleton. He had a motto. I don't know if you've got a motto. I don't know what my motto is, something like, bring more donuts maybe. But never for me the lowered banner, never the last endeavor. That was his motto. And so I've adopted that. I've got a tag on my running shoes that has my name and my phone number. In case I collapse dead, they'll know where to drag the body. but on those, it's called road ID. On that road ID tag, you can put a motto. So that's the motto I put. I want to be like Shackleton. So I put never the lowered banner, never the last endeavor. And when they drag my body off that trail that I was running when I had my heart attack, that's what they'll find on my shoe tag. Carolyn Alexander, I mentioned her writing the definitive book on Shackleton. She said his dogged optimism. Now look at that. The adjective there defining optimism or modifying it is dogged. He was relentless. It was the cornerstone of his character. For Shackleton, life would always offer more chances. He was not distracted by the demons of regret or the fear of failure. And so we can't just say, well, I'm not an optimistic person by nature, I'm a realistic person. We need to begin to cultivate within us that vision for what can be, even in the midst of a grim circumstance. So one of the things I did during our furlough, we got 650 people that are off work. I said, we need a way to communicate with our employees. And so we tried to find several different ways to do that. We have an all-user email, and we get many of our employees there, but not all of them have internet connections. So we tried to do that. We created an employee Facebook page just for employees, and I would post videos on there. And I got to tell you, some days I was not feeling real optimistic. Maybe my motto is this, because I used to always say this to my kids: you got to act better than you feel. Because if we acted the way we felt, we'd be shooting people on the interstate, right? We have to put our emotions secondary and act in accordance with our values. That's kind of the fundamental premise of ethics. And so I would post videos on there, and sometimes I'd get through and I'd watch it before I post it, and I think, man, I sounded more optimistic about that than I really feel. That's okay. I was trying to envision a better future in a grim circumstance and make sure that I was leading with an optimistic perspective. So I didn't always get it right, and sometimes I admitted, and I think this is an important point too, to admit vulnerabilities. I had to admit in some of those video posts, hey, I'm feeling some anxiety about the future, and you may be too, and that's okay if you are. Here's some numbers. You can consult with our employee assistance plan, get some counseling if you want to. That's okay. That's an appropriate thing to do. All right, so here's the question for you, and this is an open-ended one, so you get to use the chat box. Is there a danger associated with optimism and showing optimism during a crisis? So keep your limit your answers to maybe just 3 to 5 or 6 words. Don't write an essay. But what do you think the danger might be of showing optimism during a crisis?
All right, we've got a couple of answers coming in here already. The first one is that you could inspire others to make poor choices. Another says, not fully evaluating the entire environment could be a danger, overlooking reality. There's a danger if you allow optimism to hide risks and ignore threats. Employees may feel that you're disconnected from their reality. That's a really thoughtful one.
Right.
People might think you don't give enough credit to the current circumstances. You may seem insensitive, naive. You may overlook an important point that does lead to bad results. You can invalidate other people's perspective on the risk of danger.
Yeah, I think those are all good observations.
Yes.
Get some more?
Yes. It just looks like a lot of not recognizing what the reality is.
Yeah. So I think many of you that have chimed in there recognize optimism sounds really good and it kind of feels good, until you scratch and sniff and you find out, well, the guy's optimistic because he doesn't have a clue, right? He doesn't have a firm grip on reality. That's why he's optimistic. He's skipping down the sidewalk, but he's not paying attention to the dangerous dogs that are ahead. So you need a balance. You need to be, I think, here's another guy you may have never heard of, Jimmy Doolittle. He was a leader in the Air Force in World War II. And after Pearl Harbor was bombed, FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, decided he wanted to do something symbolic. He wanted to bomb Japan in retaliation for them bombing Pearl Harbor. But we weren't ready for that. We didn't have any carriers that could get that far. We certainly didn't have any bombers that could go that far. And so the military powers got a hold of Jimmy Doolittle, who became known as the master of the calculated risk. And Doolittle came up with an idea how to carry out this symbolic bombing of Japan, just to kind of punch them back a little bit and say, we're not going to take this laying down. And so he retrofitted the bombers with extra gas tanks. They had to pull out everything that wasn't absolutely necessary in the plane. They put bombs in there, and they put extra gas tanks. And here was the catch: they could fly to Japan and they could bomb Tokyo, but they couldn't get back home. They wouldn't have enough gas. So they were going to have to ditch their airplanes over China, which at that time was an ally of the US, and then fend for themselves. And so Jimmy Doolittle led this successful raid of Tokyo, again, mostly symbolic, but a very successful raid. And his autobiography, the title of his autobiography is "I Could Never Get This Lucky Again." Doesn't that sound like an optimistic guy? But he didn't just go, well, let's get our bombers in the air and we'll do the best we can. Let's see if we get there, because I'm optimistic about it. No, he understood the realistic challenges and he prepared for them. So that's the kind of optimism we're talking about here. All right, well, thanks for participating in that. We've got one more poll coming up in a few minutes, so keep by your mouse. All right, so another, I think, survival skill is to be decisive. It's the courage to make choices even without all the facts. You will never have all the facts you need to make decisions, particularly in a crisis, when you're having to make decisions on a pretty quick basis. And so you've got to find a comfort level, even though you're uncomfortable with it, of making decisions with maybe 60, 70% of the information you need or that you'd like to have in order to make a decision. And Shackleton was good at that. When they got stuck, ultimately Shackleton had to decide, I have to abandon this goal that I've been working on for years. I've recruited men, I've bought a ship, I tried to raise funds. And he finally said to Captain Frank Worsley, it looks like we shan't cross the Antarctic continent after all. It's a pity, but it can't be helped. It's the men we have to think about now. And you can see the flavor of why he became known as a man who put his men first, embedded in that quote. But he's making a decision. We're going to have to abandon the goal, and now the new goal is to be oriented towards survival. We came up with this great strategic plan at Goodwill that we made into a big chart that's on our conference room wall, and it's got all the things we're going to do this year. You know, hey, we're not going to accomplish the things we thought we were going to accomplish. So I stuck a new banner over our strategic goal, and I said our new goal is vanquish the virus. That's what we're going to do, and we're in survival mode. We're going to try to keep an eye on ultimate goals, but we're going to recognize we've got to pivot here. So we had to make a decision about furlough pay and benefits. Do we continue, or when we furlough people, do we just tell them, hey, go apply for unemployment? And we're not a wealthy organization, but we had to make a decision. We're going to have to do some sacrificing of the organization's financial status in order to create a bit of a bridge, not as much as we would have loved to have done, but a bridge of sorts. So we gave a week's pay and continued carrying benefits really through April and May for our furloughed workers. And that helped them bridge into their unemployment benefits. But even as recently as earlier this week, some of our folks had not yet received their debit cards from the Employment Security Commission. So despite our best efforts, we couldn't provide exactly the kind of safety net we'd like to, but we had to make that decision, even though we couldn't see way down the road to know what are the consequences, the economic consequences going to be of this. We knew we didn't really have that money, but again, we were looking through the lens of an employee-first culture when we made that decision. All right, two more. Wholehearted. Saying and acting like you're all in. It's easy when we're in survival mode to take a, I don't care. You know, I'm just get another donut, eat another bag of Fritos. I'm not going to lean in because I'm tired. I'm physically tired. I'm mentally tired. I'm not going to check in completely. I'm going to check out. So Shackleton was all in. It seemed like every day he was all in. So I mentioned that when they got to South Georgia Island, they had to go over this huge glacier. I don't know how many thousands of feet. And these are guys that are in clothing that they've worn for 19 months, right? So it's worn out. The shoes are worn out. They ended up taking screws out of their ship and screwing them through the soles of their shoes so they could have some grip on the ice as they climbed over the top of this glacier. And they got to the top of the glacier very close to sunset. And Shackleton knew, we can't stay up here. We'll freeze to death. We've got to get down this hill. But it was a huge, huge descent. And the only way they could get down that descent before sundown was to slide. It was dangerous because there were crevasses. They could fall into a crevasse. And so Shackleton said to his men, I don't like our position at all. We've got to take a risk. Are you game, boys? And he made it almost like, okay, let's get together. We're going to slide down on our backs. They didn't have toboggans or anything. We're just going to slide down because we've got to accomplish this or we're going to freeze to death up here on this glacier. And Frank Wild was on that slide down the hill. He said it was the most fun he'd had in 19 months. He said as they were sliding down, and I don't know how many minutes it took them, he said they were laughing as they went. It was almost giddy. They knew the danger that was involved, but it was a way Shackleton was saying, okay, we got to go all in because otherwise we're not going to survive. So they slid down this gigantic hill. This is not an actual photo, but that gives you the idea of what they did. And they made it. They were able to embrace that. So sometimes we have to show we're all in by personal sacrifice. So we've done that here at our executive team. We've made some personal sacrifices and for the good of the organization. And I think that's a measure of wholeheartedness. We made on our executive team, our pay cuts voluntary, and everybody volunteered. We're willing to take a pay cut. And I think that's an indication, it's a vote, it's a raised hand that says, I'm all in. All right, I think the next to last one is integrity. We got one more after this. Choosing the right thing even when nobody is watching. So I want to ask this is another time for you to weigh in. We all think integrity is a great thing, right? It's one of the core values. It's a core value here at Goodwill. But is there a danger to integrity during a time of crisis? Is there a downside risk to it? So what do you think?
All right, the chat is open.
And your comments are anonymous, so we won't think you're down on integrity if you say something.
I'm seeing a lot saying that they don't think there is a danger of having integrity in time of crisis. Integrity works at all times. Personal material loss in the short term may be your risk. Someone says integrity may be exploited by others. Others say that it's more dangerous to not maintain your integrity. Some are saying that integrity creates a more trusting environment. It could expose your vulnerabilities. It says not demonstrating integrity during challenging times could be unsettling to those you lead and make the difficult time more stressful. Someone says nothing worse than being disappointed in yourself. It's not worth it to sacrifice.
All right. All right. All good answers. So here's my take on it, and I'm big on integrity. It's one of the things I want on my tombstone when I die. Encouragement, enthusiasm, integrity. That's what's going to be on my tombstone. My wife tells me I'm not going to be around to ensure that happens, but she said she would take care of it for me. So remember the history of integrity, the history of the word from your 8th grade math class. Integers, whole numbers. So integrity is wholeness. I'm not two-faced. I don't act one way in Las Vegas and another way here. But I think there is a potential danger in integrity, and I say that with some pause because I don't want to be misunderstood. I think it's essential to be a person of integrity and for people to believe you to be a person of integrity. But sometimes integrity can, if we get so locked into something that we think is a matter of integrity, that we lose perhaps some required flexibility in the midst of a crisis. So let me show you what I mean. Shackleton was a big believer in integrity, but he was a flexible kind of guy. So here's one of his quotes. Life to me is the greatest of all games. The danger lies in treating it as a trivial game, a game to be taken lightly, a game where the rules don't matter much. But the rules do matter a great deal. The game has to be played fairly or it is no game at all. And even to win the game is not the chief end. The chief end is to win it honorably and splendidly. So it sounds like this is a guy with integrity, right? He's going to make rules and stick with them. But there were times where he had to apply the rules, perhaps in a more liberal-handed way because of the exigencies of his circumstance. And there was a carpenter that was a member of his crew named McNish. And McNish revolted at one point. He refused to do his tasks. He wasn't going to cooperate anymore. He was suffering from fatigue, probably. And if you disobey your captain's order, I mean, not that they could make him walk the plank, but it's a capital kind of an offense. Mutiny is punishable by death. But Shackleton didn't do that with McNish. He didn't kill him. He didn't even really discipline him. He did privately chastise him, but he wasn't so bound up in a rigid adherence of rules that he didn't understand there has to be a practical application. So when I say that, I'm not saying we go soft on integrity. Don't misunderstand me to say that. What I am saying is let's be careful that we're not so rigid in our self-righteous adherence to what we think is the proper rule to follow or the proper path of integrity to follow, that we don't take into consideration the practicalities that are presented to us during a crisis. So here's an example. This is a facsimile photo of my CFO, Stephanie Bailey. It's not really Stephanie, but I thought this kind of looked like probably some moments that she had when we were trying to figure out, do we qualify for a COVID loan? Those of you that may have experienced applying for it, and that the rules kept changing, and first it was only if you had under 500 employees, and then it was, well, maybe if you have over 500 employees, you might be able to qualify. It was trying to nail Jello to a tree. And we tried to strike, we wanted that money. We needed that money to stay afloat, but we wanted to make sure that we qualified properly for it. And it was not an easy task because they kept modifying and changing the rules. And that's not a criticism of the government. It was an evolving situation that they were trying to deal with. But this is the kind of thing, we want to adhere to the rules while making sure that we have a good perception of the practical application of those rules. So shout out to Stephanie Bailey. Thank you for anguishing over making sure that we qualified for those loans. All right, the last one is laughter, lots of laughter. And the Mayo Clinic says laughter can ease your physical pain, but it can also make it easier to cope with difficult circumstances. It helps you connect with other people and improves your mood. And as I was looking over these skills and traits, I thought I would not give myself a great grade in this. I'd like to think of myself as a person with a good sense of humor, but I probably have not done enough affirmatively in my work environment to promote lots of laughter. It's a good tension reliever, and it's important, and it's not something that diminishes the importance of the crisis. You might get some self-righteous people that say, you shouldn't be laughing about this. Don't you know we're $3 million in debt? It's not that, but it helps release the pressure and lend to the camaraderie when you can enjoy laughter. So Shackleton was big on humor. And when he recruited people like physicist Richard James, he didn't ask about his resume or his GPA. He said, can you sing? I don't mean anything like Caruso, but you can shout a bit with the boys, can't you? He was already foreseeing the need for humor and levity once they got to Antarctica. And so once they got stuck, he organized things like shaved head contests, winter sports, dress-up talent shows. He made sure that humor was a central part of their survival kit. And I think that's really important. You can't be too serious in a crisis. You're dealing with a serious situation. I have a poster in my office. It's a picture of two kids dressed up like Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy. They got the freckles on their face and little wigs. I've had this poster on my wall since college. And it says, don't take yourself too seriously. So we need to take our situations seriously. We need to think thoughtfully, but don't take yourself so seriously that you're really grim and you're gripping the sides of the podium with white knuckles as you're giving your speech. It's okay to lighten up and enjoy humor. So how does this all add up? Well, amazingly enough, it spells goodwill. So you've got your grace, you've got your other-oriented nature, you've got optimism, that's realistic optimism. You can be decisive even if you don't have all the facts. You're all in, wholehearted, like Shackleton was sliding down the glacier. You show integrity, but with an eye towards the practical application of the rules. And you engage in laughter, lots of laughter, which is absolutely critical survival skill during times of crisis. And the good news is this, you already possess these traits. Now, as we've been going through it, if you're kind of a self-analytical person, you're thinking, oh, I get a D- on that, or I'm not very good in that area. You possess currently all these traits because at some time in your life, you've shown at least a little bit of each one of these. If you think back through your life, there's been at least one occasion where in the midst of a bad circumstance, you were other-oriented. You did something for someone else. When in a hopeless situation, you were the one that tried to be the voice of optimism. In a crisis situation, when everybody else was kind of tense, you were the one that broke the ice with a little bit of humor. Now, you may not be 100%. Your tank is full on each of these traits, but you've got at least a kernel of each of these within you. And so what you need to do is water it and make the kernel sprout a little bit and grow a little bit more, particularly during the crisis. And when you do, when you further develop these survival skills and these traits that experience is helping us learn, good, will come. So I appreciate your attention. I think most of you have stayed awake. I didn't see anybody nodding off in the audience this time. I'll be glad to stand for cross-examination. Bailey, do we have any time for questions?
We do have just a couple minutes if you all are willing to stay on. If you need to go, that's fine as well, but we will stay. I'm seeing lots of compliments to you, Jim. You can use the Q&A portion, or you can just throw a question into the chat and we will discuss it. Let's see, I'm seeing lots of thanks. No Q&A yet. It looks like we're just getting lots of thanks, Jim. I think you were thorough. Oh, one question. Oh, someone asked you, Jim, what is a book that you're currently reading?
I read about 5 or 6 books at one time. So I'm reading one by a guy named Doug Preston, who is a really interesting author called Looking at the Ground. And it's about, he's a journalist who takes a journey with his fiance and her 11-year-old daughter across very arid, abandoned territory in southwestern part of the United States. He wrote a really interesting book. I got onto Preston by reading a book a few months ago called In Search of the Monkey God, about his true story about going down to South America looking for a lost city. And so Doug Preston's kind of an adventurer. So I'm doing that one. I'm reading a book called How We Got the Bible. I'm preparing to teach a Sunday school series on that. So that's another book I'm reading. And then I'm reading a book of articles written by a journalist named Edith Johnson, who wrote for the Oklahoman back in the 1920s to the 1950s and was one of the founding members of Goodwill. And so I got a book of her newspaper columns from the 1920s. So I'm reading those.
Great.
I'm an eclectic collection.
Yeah, we've got one more question here. Who was the last figure you used before you used Shackleton?
Albert Schweitzer, probably. He was another one of those guys that I read about in a footnote, and I thought, I've heard the name Albert Schweitzer, but I don't know anything about him. And he was such a big-hearted man, particularly in his efforts in Africa. Would have been back in the, I think, late 1800s, early 1900s. So Schweitzer, probably.
Okay, great. And then I've got another one here. Someone said that they've already downloaded an audiobook about Shackleton, but someone asked which book about him is your favorite.
I think the Carolyn Alexander book. Shackleton actually wrote one called South, and I'm sure he probably wrote it with somebody, but he's the principal author, so it's kind of semi-autobiographical. No, I take that back. Alfred Lansing wrote that book. That had been the definitive book on the trip until Carolyn Alexander's, but Carolyn Alexander's got phenomenal photographs from that photographer that was a member of the crew. So she's my favorite book.
Okay, great. And one last one from Travis Jones. Are you still wearing all kinds of crazy hats, Jim?
I have a bag of a big garbage bag. This started back in college. I led a singing group. It was a comedy singing group. We weren't great on music, but we were big on comedy, at least ourselves. We thought we were funny. And everybody had to wear a crazy hat. And we recently had a Zoom, it was called the Glee Club, and we had a Zoom Glee Club reunion. And the requirement was you had to have a crazy hat on to get in the Zoom room.
Great. Awesome. Well, I think that wraps us up for today. Thank you everyone for staying on and for joining us today. I hope you all have another nice day of social distancing, and we don't have any more programs for the rest of the summer. It's actually time for us to go ahead and take summer break, and we are being conscious of the situation as we move forward to fall. So we hope to see you in person. If not, we may see you again on Zoom. All right. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Myrna. And thanks, everybody.